The rascal's head was fetched up. With a dislocating jerk, his feet pawed the air for an instant, and his hands lost their hold of the shafts. Then, as he came down and tried vainly to get a footing, the careering rickshaw rammed him from behind and sent him sprawling on his face. Shot. Out from his seat went Captain O'Shea, his feet in front of him, a revolver in his fist, ready to bound up from the pavement and open the engagement on the instant. The pushman had been violently poked under the chin by the back of the suddenly halted rickshaw, and he lay groaning and doubled up several feet away. The ruffianly escort, taken by surprise, ran a little distance before they could wheel and return to the scene. Captain O'Shea had a moment in which to get his bearings and take stock of the situation. Darting for the nearest wall, he braced his back against it and stood waiting. The big swarthy rascals in the blue blouses fiercely jabbered together, gazed up and down the almost deserted street, and, with no more delay, drew knives from their baggy breeches and charged with heads down. O'Shea threw up his revolver for a snapshot at the foremost of them. The hammer clicked. There was no report. He pulled the trigger again with the same result. For the third time the hammer fell, with the same futile, sickening click. This was his finish. The thing was absurd, incredible, raging. He grasped the weapon by the barrel and ran forward to swing the butt against the nearest shaven head. A long knife ripped at him and slashed his sleeve. He cracked the man's head, but the others were at him like wolves. He dodged and tried to take to his heels, but the two rickshaw men blocked his path. One of the assassins had worked around behind him and was trying to trip and get him down so that they could cut him to ribbons at their leisure. The knives hemmed him in. He slipped and fell upon one knee. The ruffians laughed. Then, lo and behold, they were scampering frantically away, yelling in fear, scrambling over walls like monkeys, diving into the stables and courtyards, flying for the lower end of the street. In a twinkling, Captain O'Shea was alone, magically snatched from death. White and shaking, he stood and gazed at a nearby corner of the crooked thoroughfare. Filing past it came a squad of British bluejackets in white clothes, and the sun winked brightly on the polished metal of their rifles and cutlasses. Beside the lieutenant, in front of them, strode a tall, slim-waisted man in khaki uniform whom O'Shea recognized as Inspector Burke. O'Shea's assailants had been warned in time to scurry to cover before the British party had more than a flying glimpse of them. At a quick order shouted by the lieutenant, the sailors scattered into the yards and squalid buildings, but the fugitives had escaped by a dozen dark and devious exits to vanish in the labyrinths of the teeming, mysterious native city. Inspector Burke was pounding O'Shea on the back and exclaiming vigorously, "My word, old chap! What sort of a bally-row is this? The beggars nearly did for you. Lucky we happened along, wasn't it?" "'Tis all of that," earnestly replied the shipmaster. "And who are ye, anyhow? Is this a fairy story or a play right out of the theater? You came on the stage about 1 second before the curtain rung down. Lieutenant Kempton Shaw, here he is. Allow me to present him, Captain O'Shea." As I was about to say, he came ashore from the Warspite gunboat this mornin' with a batch of Chinese pirates. The real thing, don't you know? He took them out of a junk after a rather nice little shindig last week. He marched them to the Chinese prison just now. It's in this quarter of the native city, and their heads will be cut off tomorrow. I'm awfully pleased that we were taking this shortcut home. In close quarters. Weren't you? I have never found them a closer fit, said O'Shea. I was on me way for a chat with the governor, and a gang of bad citizens tried to wipe me out. I will walk along with you if ye don't mind. There is enough Irish in me to waste no great love on the British flag, but I will say, Lieutenant Kempton Shaw, that I never laid eyes on a finer, handsomer lot of men than these lads of yours. From the war's pite. Thanks, and I fancy you mean it, smiled the naval officer. This is extraordinary, by Jove. Foreigners are fairly safe in the native city, as a rule. Are they not, Burke? What do you make of it? I shall have to hear Captain O'Shea's report. I have no long-winded report to offer, incisively declared the shipmaster. I have me suspicions. And you can guess what they are, Inspector Burke. 'Tis the same business that we talked about in your office. But I wish nothing to do with any police investigations. You will report this row of mine to the native government, I have no doubt, and I hope ye will try to collect an indemnity for me distressed emotions, but I have no time to dilly-dally about in Shanghai. I will go to sea. Will you help me find the men? From the tone of your voice I infer that your business is not precisely pacific, my dear sir, put in Lieutenant Kempton Shaw. Do you mind letting the war's pites in on this cruise of yours? Thank you, but I have set out to handle it as an affair of me own. I may have bit off more than I can chew, but I will try to see it through. Meet me at my office at noon and I'll have some men for you to look over, said Inspector Burke. I will pick up a crew for you if I have to make a general jail delivery. As they trudged along, Captain O'Shea became silent and abstracted. He was not in a mood for conversation. Conjecture pointed one way. He had been a gullible fool who deserved to have a knife stuck in his ribs. It had been as easy to trap him as though he were a lubber on his first voyage out from home. It had been with design that only one rickshaw stood in front of the hotel that morning when he was ready to go to the native city. And the pair of coolies were hired cutthroats who had steered him into the disgusting street among the slaughterhouses, in order that he might be done away with, leaving never a trace of his fate behind him. Reasoning back from this link to the next preceding, his room had been entered and ransacked while he was safely out of the way in a carriage on the Bubbling Well Road. Some time had been required to make that careful examination and fit keys to his handbag and trunk. Also, he had just now investigated his revolver and discovered that the firing pin of the hammer had been filed, not enough for the eye to notice it, but sufficiently to cause the impact to fail to explode the primer of the cartridge. The affable, gilded young gentleman who had invited him to drive on the Bubbling Well Road was the same kind acquaintance who had suggested that he take a rickshaw and visit the native city in the morning. The finger of coincidence pointed in the direction of that smartest of compradors, Charlie Tongsin. That kind of coincidence is unhealthier than the cholera, said O'Shea to himself. Maybe this sport with the college education and the taste for gin cocktails is a good friend of mine, but I will give him no chance to prove it again. I have been on the jump ever since I met him. If he is not crooked, he is a hoodoo. And 'tis not impossible, after all, that he is mixed up with this gang of murderers that I am running after. The heart of him is Chinese. He would keep these suspicions to himself. They lacked tangible proof, and he held to the view that the business was entirely his own. He had plunged into this befogged maze of circumstances like a boy on a holiday, and it was for him to extricate himself. Like a man, with the warmest expressions of gratitude, he parted from Inspector Burke and the naval lieutenant, and hastened in the direction of the waterfront. Less than an hour later he was inspecting a light draft steamer called the Huang Ho, owned by the China Navigation Company. She was old, sadly in need of repairs, and about as seaworthy for rough weather as a packing box. But O'Shea felt confident that she could be nursed along to serve his purpose. And the larger, better vessels available for charter at short notice were not so handy for exploring muddy rivers and strange corners. Having put to sea at one time and another in craft which were held together only by their paint, Captain O'Shea asked no more of the Huang Ho than that her engines should turn over. He dared not examine the machinery too closely lest he might lose confidence in his steamer, but the owner's agent assured him that she was fit for service, and he took his word for it. Start her fires going at once, said O'Shea, and if enough pressure shows on the gauges to turn her will as she lies at her moorings, I will sign the charter party and insurance papers and slap down the $2,000 for a month's use of the venerable relic. That is fair enough, replied the agent. And it is as good as done. You can go ahead with getting your supplies, Captain O'Shea. I take it that you want to do a bit of exploration work for one of the American syndicates? We have done quite a lot of business with your people and their concessions. It may be something like that, briefly returned O'Shea. And now will you be kind enough to tell me where to order 150 tons of steam coal to be put in the bunkers this very day? Our company will be pleased to let you have it, and I can guarantee prompt delivery from lighters alongside the steamer. Or I presume that Jordan Margetson will do the same for you. I think I will not deal with Jordan Margetson. And O'Shea's voice was smooth and pleasant. The comprador is a very able young man. Charlie Tong Sin? Well, rather a smart chap, that. Yes, very. I wish I could keep my razor as sharp. Captain O'Shea next visited a ship chandler's and submitted his list of stores, making it a condition of payment that the stuff should be in the steamer before sunset. The elderly German who served him had the tact and discretion bred of long experience with the seafarers of the unexpected Orient. It was his business to sell them whatever they might want, to take his profit and ask no questions. Yes, he could find 30 service rifles and revolvers, also cutlasses of the best steel. They were of patterns discarded by a certain European government, but excellent weapons. He would be glad to sell the captain 1, 5, or 10,000 of them. The captain was not a man to wag a foolish tongue, one could see it at a glance. You and I might do business some day, quoth O'Shea, but I am too busy to start a revolution at present. He sent a note to Paddy Blake asking him to find a dozen Chinese firemen and sailors and a river pilot, and to muster them ready for signing articles in the afternoon. He believed the old Irishman to be a ripened scoundrel at his own trade, but suspected him of no complicity in the maneuvers of Charlie Tong Sin. The comprador had merely used Paddy Blake as a means of making the acquaintance of Captain O'Shea. 5 minutes after noon the shipmaster, he had taken a decided dislike to riding in rickshaws, trudged into the headquarters building of Inspector Burke. "I have a choice collection for you to look over," said the latter. "They are waiting in another room. And I should call them a worried lot. I sent my men out to pick them up, do you see, and they have not been told the reason why. I cannot afford to be particular, Inspector Burke. Let me at them and I will see whether I am safer ashore among the Chinese or at sea with your exhibit of beachcombers." "Oh, they are not as bad as that," the inspector assured him. "I should scarcely call them desperate characters. However, while I wish you the best of luck, old chap, I shall shed never a tear if you lose your shipmates somewhere beyond Shanghai. Let us call them soldiers of misfortune, if you like." He led the way into the large drill room, where a score or more of men stood in uneasy attitudes and appeared not at all comfortable in this environment. O'Shea let his glance rove in swift, appraising scrutiny, and smiled to himself as he recognized one familiar type after another. He had recruited such men as these for unostentatious ventures in the waters of the Spanish Main. Here was the red-faced, burly shipmaster ready with a glib speech and fluent curses to explain how he happened to be without his papers. The shambling ne'er-do-well with the slack mouth, and the weak chin who had fled from a scrape at home to lose himself in foreign ports, the tanned adventurer, brave and resourceful, who was fit for nothing else than the life of a rover, the battered old seaman, worn out by the hardships of the forecastle, who had been cast adrift from the hospital, the cashiered army officer with the hallmark of his caste blurred but still visible, the sharp-featured young man with the furtive eye who lived by his wits and found it very hard living indeed, the bleary tropical tramp who would sell his soul for a drink of brandy. These and the rest of them were seedy in various ways. They conveyed a sense of failure, of having lost their grip. Their clothes did not signify this so much as what life had written in their faces. Several, in fact, were dressed in clean white duck and linen. They were fighting hard to preserve the guise of self-respect. And yet every man of them had marched to police headquarters at a word from Inspector Burke with the sick fear in his heart that his past had overtaken him, or that he was to be deported for the good of the community, or that he was to be locked up as a vagrant. Inspector Burke felt pity for them. It was heartless to keep the poor devils in this painful suspense. With a curt nod he addressed them in a group, for they had unwittingly drifted together as if finding some small comfort in solidarity. "This is not police business," said he. "I sent for you to oblige my friend Captain O'Shea. He will explain what he wants, and I advise you to play square with him, and I'm quite sure he will make it worthwhile." At this the company brightened and looked immensely relieved. The hangdog manner fled. Shoulders were braced, heads held erect. They were like different men. O'Shea had a less pessimistic opinion of them. He had already concluded to show no finicky taste by picking and choosing. He would take them in a lump, good, bad, and indifferent. Those who were really competent would soon disclose it on shipboard, and they could help him hammer the others into shape. "My speech to you will be short and sweet," said he. "I need men for a voyage coastwise, and me steamer will be ready to sail tonight. You will live well, and I expect yet to obey orders. 'Tis not sailor's work, or I should not take on your kind. The fewer questions ye ask, the more popular yet will be with me. The pay will be at the rate of $5 a day gold, but I will give no advances. I want ye to come aboard sober. If you handle yourselves like men, I will pay ye a bonus at the end of the voyage. Those that want to go will give me their names. Not a man hung back or asked a question. They whispered softly among themselves, as if afraid to make a slip that might break the spell. Captain O'Shea had one thing more to say, and they listened with the most devout attention. I took note of the small Hotel London down by the waterside. 'Tis a clean, decent place, and I have had a word with the landlord. I will give every man me card. If you show it to him, he will be pleased to entertain ye at dinner at once, and he will hand ye out cigars and 3 drinks apiece. No more. And I will meet you there for supper at 6 o'clock tonight. Excellent strategy, murmured Inspector Burke. By the way, cried O'Shea to his pleased followers, I overlooked something. I need a chief engineer. Can any one of you qualify? It appeared that none of them was sufficiently acquainted with the internal works of a steamer to pass as an expert, although a young man of a very Cockney accent thought he might do as an assistant. Inspector Burke made haste to remark, I say, let me give you the very man for the job. Kittredge is his name. It's rather awkward, for he is in Clink at present, the British jail. But his time expires tomorrow. He was given 30 days, and I dare say the magistrate will be willing to sign release papers if I explain the situation. I am not asking me men for references, observed O'Shea, but, as a matter of mild curiosity, what did ye put this Kittredge away for? He tried to whip my entire Sikh police force, and he made a jolly good beginning. Then his ship sailed away and left him in quod. He was engineer in a Cardiff tramp. A very good man, I understand. He sounds like it. His references are most satisfactory. Especially what he did to your Turb and cops, O'Shea cordially affirmed. Send this Kittredge to the Hotel London, if ye please, and give him this card of mine, and tell him to wait for me there. Through the afternoon Captain Michael O'Shea, now master of the aged river steamer Hoang Ho, was the busiest and most energetic of men. 101 things presented themselves as necessary to be done, when at length he hurried into the Hotel London shortly before the supper hour. His men were waiting, hopeful, expectant, cheerful, smoking his cigars and with the 3 drinks apiece tucked under their belts. Among them was a lanky, solemn person with a pair of grey side whiskers and a leathery complexion crisscrossed by a network of fine wrinkles. His whole appearance was eminently decorous and respectable, and he seemed to have strayed into the wrong company. It was not far-fetched to conjecture that he might be a missionary from some station in the Chinese hinterland who had kindly concerned himself with the souls of this congregation of black sheep. Captain O'Shea bowed to him with a puzzled, respectful air, at which the pious stranger remarked, Inspector Burke told me to report here and be damn quick about it. I am Kittredge, and I hear you are wanting an engineer. Excuse me, Mr. Kittredge. I came near mistaken you for a sky pilot. And so your favorite pastime is beating up Sikh policemen. I have a job for ye at double the wages you got in your tramp steamer, whatever they were. Are you willing? I would sign on with the devil himself to get clear of this blankety-blank pig hole of a blistering Shanghai, promptly exclaimed Mr. Kittredge. Where's your ship? Shall I go aboard at once? Please take a look at the engine room and report to me here. She is the Huang Ho, tied up at the China Navigation Company's wharf. Don't be too critical, but if there's work that is absolutely necessary, I will send ye machinists to work all night. I know the condemned little hooker by sight. Bitterly quoth Mr. Kittredge with a tug at his starboard whisker. Very well, sir. I will take a squint at her and make out my list of engine room stores. Can you get them tonight? The ship chandler is waiting to hear from me. And I have sent word to the machine shop, briefly answered O'Shea. Paddy Blake had very promptly raked up the required number of Chinese hands and was ready to deliver them on board whenever required. To the Hotel London he came, towing by the arm a most extraordinarily bent and shriveled anatomy with a wisp of a white queue, whom he turned over to Captain O'Shea with the explanation. Here is a river and coastwise pilot for ye that is as wise as Confucius. And by the same token, I have no doubt that he was once pilot aboard the junk of that grand old philosopher himself. Or maybe he was shipmates with Noah. The ancient mariner croaked a phrase or two in a grating, rusty voice, and O'Shea dubiously observed, if he talks no English at all, how will I tell him where I want to go? I have sent ye a Chinese boss and that can sling th. Pigeon, said Paddy Blake. Dearly would I love to know where ye are bound and what bobbery ye are up to, Captain Mike O'Shea, but a man in my business has learned to ask no more silly questions than he can help. Keep that magnum on ice till I come back to Shanghai and I will spin ye the yarn in the little back room of yours, Paddy. May ye come back right side up, warmly exclaimed the old man. By th look of the friends yet have mustered to go with you, I would say that yet are bound out on what th Shanghai diplomats call a policy of benevolent assimilation. The report of the aggrieved Mr. Kittredge was to the effect that while the engines of the Huang Ho would probably take her to sea without breaking down, a night's work on the condenser, not to mention a leaky cylinder, would considerably improve her health. Captain O'Shea told him to drive ahead with these repairs, nor was the delay worth fretting about. Things had gone amazingly well thus far, and the Huang Ho would be ready to sail in the morning. He had no desire to spend another night ashore, and he would take his company on board at once, assign them to quarters, and make a tentative organization for sea duty. The Huang Ho had been fitted for passenger service on the Yangtze, and there were staterooms on the upper deck to hold twice the number of O'Shea's recruits. In the Chinese draft sent aboard by Paddy Blake were a cook and a steward trained to their business, and they put things to rights in their quiet, deft way. The mood of Captain O'Shea became normally cheerful and confident. He had a deck under his feet, his word was law, and it was good to hear the lap of salt water and the swirl of the tide against a vessel's side. He was awake and about until midnight. The work in the engine room was progressing rapidly under the vehement direction of Mr. Kittredge. Feeling the need of sleep, for the preceding night had been a broken one, Captain O'Shea set a watch in charge of the burly shipmaster of his company, whom he appointed first mate, and went to his bunk in the cabin just abaft the wheelhouse. At 3 o'clock, Mr. Kittredge, very hot and grimy, rapped on the door and gruffly announced that the machinists had gone ashore and he proposed to turn in and sleep until sailing time. At 6 o'clock Captain O'Shea went on deck in his pajamas to order the steward to fetch him a cup of coffee. He saw no reason why the steamer should Not get underway at once. The Chinese steward came not at his call, and he betook himself to the galley. A fire was burning in the range, rice and potatoes were cooking in the pots, bacon sliced on the table ready for frying, but there was no cook. O'Shea looked puzzled and started for the forecastle. On the way he met his first mate, whose demeanor was distressed and excited. "I was about to call you, sir," he exclaimed, his red face working with emotion. "You will think I've made a hash of my first night on duty, but this insane business happened like a shot out of a gun. Sir, not 10 minutes ago the Chin-A men, every last one of 'em, came boiling on deck and went over the side to the wharf like so many rats. And they never did stop running. They were scared, it was a panic. But they didn't stop to jabber. They just flew, and most of 'em left their dunnage behind." "The devil you say," muttered O'Shea, and he rubbed his head in slightly bewildered fashion. "That must have been just before I stepped on deck. Mr. Parkinson. And ye have no idea at all what it was about?" "Not the slightest, sir." "I hope you don't blame me. I'd have sailed into the thick of them with my fists, but it was like chasing so many greased pigs. They vanished before you could more than wink." "What about the fires?" snapped the captain. "Have you been below?" "Yes, sir. The first thing I did was to find Mr. Kittredge. He is in the engine room, and he told me to send down half a dozen of our white men to keep up steam." "Good enough. Now sing out for a volunteer, cook, and I will investigate this comical performance. Did anybody get aboard to talk to these Chin-A men?" "Not a soul, sir." "I'm sure of it. I had a reliable man at the gangway, and another on the wharf." "I believe you. While I look around a bit, get the ship ready to go to sea, Mr. Parkinson. 'Tis not in me mind to be hung up in port very long." A sailing junk was attempting to reach with the morning breeze across the wide stretch of river. Hauling close to the wharf at which the Hoang Ho was moored, the junk attempted to come about, but missed stays in lubberly fashion and hung in the wind as she slowly drifted past the steamer stern. The Chinese who clung to the long tiller, and the others who stood upon the poop or hauled on the cordage, were gazing with signs of excitement at the Hoang Ho. Several of them gesticulated, and their fingers were aimed at the rounded, overhanging stern of Captain O'Shea's vessel. He caught sight of those antics and walked aft. There was no good reason why the crew of the passing junk should make such a fuss over this commonplace river steamer. Their singular interest in her might be worth trying to fathom. Without delaying to seek the gangway, he threw his leg around a taut-end hawser and slid down to the wharf. Running out to the end of it, he commanded a clear view of the stern of the Hoang Ho. Upon the white woodwork, just above the counter, was painted in broad strokes of bright vermilion the sprawling Chinese character which had been gashed in the back of the sailor named Jim Eldridge. Captain O'Shea hastily returned on board and climbed over the after rail, belaying a loose end of heaving line and resting his foot in the loop so that he was able to let himself down until he could touch the uppermost smear of vermilion paint. It rubbed off on his hand, fresh and wet, and must have been applied during the night. His Chinese crew had discovered it there. Perhaps someone had sung out the information from a passing junk or sampan. At any rate, this was what had made them quit the steamer. A charge of dynamite could have made their exodus no more expeditious. The word had flown from mouth to mouth, and they fled from the ship as from the plague. Even the incredibly aged pilot had hobbled away with the rest of them, fear restoring an agility long since departed. The hoodoo again, reflectively exclaimed. O'Shea. I thought I had got clear of it. 'Tis not so much to frighten me this time as to delay the voyage. Somebody is anxious to send word up the coast ahead of me to let someone else know I am coming. That is a guess, and 'tis as good as the next one. He would find Paddy Blake at once and discuss the matter with him. Perhaps he could ship another crew and leave port before the news had time to spread among the Chinese seafarers. Telling Mr. Parkinson to see to it that the vermilion paint was instantly removed, he set out on foot along the waterfront. At this early hour, there was no stir of business among the foreign shipping houses. Passing a substantial brick building, Captain O'Shea's eye was held for an instant by the brass sign on one of the doors, Jordan, Margetson and Co. He happened to be thinking quite assiduously just then of the courteous comprador, Charlie Tong Sin. He halted and stared hard at the door in front of him, which was ajar. It was too early for any of the clerks to be about. With an impulse which had no definite purpose behind it, Captain O'Shea pushed open the door and quietly stepped into the hallway and thence into the main office with its row of desks. The room was empty, and he moved in the direction of the smaller, detached offices in the rear, still treading softly. Yes, the shrewd and zealous comprador, so faithful to his employer's interests, was already at work. When the visitor caught sight of him, he was bending over a table littered with papers, intent on arranging and filing them. Possibly his ears were as quick as his wits, and he had heard Captain O'Shea before. Seeing him unruffled and smiling, with an air of delighted surprise, the comprador exclaimed, advancing with hand outstretched, "How glad I am to see you again. The top of the morning. Were you looking to find me?" "Ah, I am. The early bird, you bet. I expected to sail by now, but there has been a bit of trouble with me native crew," replied the shipmaster. "Wary as a hawk. I saw your place was open and I dropped in on the chance of bidding yet. Farewell. You mentioned the other night that you sometimes came down early." "That is the deuce of my business, Captain, easily," returned Charlie Tong Sin. "Trouble with your crew. Can I help you? Do you need men?" "I am sorry you didn't come to me in the first place. I wish I had. 'Twas old Paddy Blake I first turned to as one Irishman to another. And maybe I was wrong in not asking your advice about the steamer. If this were a fencing match, then O'Shea had scored the first point. His bold, ingenuous features expressed not the slightest change of emotion, but in an instant he had discovered that which clinched and drove home his suspicions of Charlie Tong Sin. The comprador put a fresh cigarette to his lips and held a lighted match between his fingers, unaware that the flare conveyed a fleeting translucence. Underneath the beautifully polished nails of his thumb and forefinger there showed a line of vermilion, which the most careful scrubbing had failed to eradicate. It was the color of the paint which had been smeared on the stern of the Hoang Ho, in the form of a sprawling Chinese character. The luck of Captain Michael O'Shea so ordered it that he should observe this phenomenon before the flare of the match died out. Thereupon he lied swiftly and plausibly, the purpose hot in his heart to find a pretext that should coax the comprador to Accompany him on board the Huang Ho. To a sympathetic query Captain O'Shea smoothly made answer. I am the kind of a man that will own up to his own mistakes. I thought I could go it alone when I ought to have been glad and thankful for the help of a man like yourself. Between us, I am not anxious to go to sea in this old tub that I have chartered from the China Navigation Company. And now that I am delayed for lack of a crew, maybe you can show me a way to slip out of the bargain. My chief engineer finds the vessel is not at all what she was represented to be. I took her subject to certain conditions and she cannot make good. I told you you would be stung in Shanghai without me, laughed Charlie Tong Sin in the greatest good humor. Better chuck up the Huang Ho and let me find you a steamer. That I will do, and gladly, affirmed O'Shea. Have ye time to step aboard with me now and I will show you how I have been buncoed. Then yet can advise me how to break the charter. I have a good case. Of course I will, cried the comprador. Pooh! We will bluff the China Navigation Company out of its boots. I will make them look like 30 cents. You are the smartest comprador between Tientsin and Singapore, according to Paddy Blake, and I have no doubt of it, sweetly murmured Captain O'Shea. That's what everybody says, affably rejoined Charlie Tong Sin as they walked into the street. What is the trouble with your crew? You can search me. I cannot find out for the life of me. They up and jumped ship without warning. I will get more men for you. Leave it to me. You have come to the right place this time, Captain O'Shea. Chatting amiably, the twain came to the wharf and climbed the gangway of the Huang Ho. That anxious first mate, Mr. Parkinson, pitiably afraid lest he lose his billet and be turned adrift because he had failed to prevent the desertion of the crew, brightened perceptibly at sight of Charlie Tong Sin and concluded that this influential young man had been persuaded to mend the troubles. Come to my room, if ye please, said Captain O'Shea to the smiling comprador, and I will summon my chief engineer. He will tell you that the steamer is not fit to make 3 knots an hour, and then we will go below. The shipmaster beckoned Mr. Parkinson to follow. The trio were passing through the wide hall of the main cabin when Captain O'Shea halted. Swinging on his heel, he stood facing Charlie Tong Sin, who started slightly, for the visage of Captain O'Shea was stern and lowering. What followed was instantaneous. The shipmaster's fist shot out and collided with the jaw of the comprador, who measured his length on the floor and appeared to be wrapped in slumber. Only the toes of his neat patent leather shoes oscillated gently. The expression of his face was singularly peaceful. The oblique eyelids were closed. The aghast Mr. Parkinson sputtered in great dismay. My God, sir, what have you done? We'll all go to jail for this. This is Jordan, Margitson's right-hand man. I have given him a sleeping powder, said O'Shea. Take him by the heels while I carry the other end of him and we will lock him in a spare stateroom. Put a guard over him. If he squeals, hit him again. And keep him quiet. The mate was about to renew his protests, but his voice died in his throat. Perceiving that he wavered miserably, Captain O'Shea spoke once more. And his accents were hard. You can make your choice, Mr. Parkinson. Yet sail with me and you play my game, or you can go ashore to rot and starve on the beach, same as when I picked ye out of the gutter. I have given this dirty young Chinese blackguard a taste of what is coming to him. Will ye fall to, or shall I kick you out of the ship? I will take your orders, sir," stammered the other. "Then help me get the steamer to sea. We will wait for no more Chinese sailors. Muster all hands." On the upper deck, they came piling up from the hold and the dining room. Abaft the galley, where most of them had been at breakfast, the inanimate comprador was no longer visible. "Will you sail with me at once or lose the chance of making the voyage?" demanded O'Shea. "Some of you will have to shovel coal and others wash dishes and do seaman's duty on deck. But I will pay yet extra for it, and we will take this old box of a steamer to where we want to go." The response was hearty and unanimous. The adventurers could think of no worse fate than to be once more stranded in Shanghai. They were well fed, they had slept in clean beds again, and their employer was a man who could be trusted to deal with them fairly. With a spirited cheer they scattered to their various stations. The chief engineer spoke briefly, his grey whiskers standing out in the morning breeze. Nobody but a wild Irishman would have the nerve to take this painted coffin to sea with a gang of misbegotten greenhorns to man her. I have steam enough to give her steerage way whenever you're ready to cast off, Captain O'Shea. Then let go, fore and aft, roared the master. Are ye pilot enough to take her down the river, Mr. Parkinson? I could do it with both eyes shut, but I'm not so familiar with the coast to the north'ard. I have a pilot for the part of the coast and the river we are bound for, grimly returned O'Shea. He is locked in a spare stateroom just now. He will know that part of China very well, for 'tis me opinion that he has been there before. V. Over a mournful, muddy expanse of the China sea wallowed a top-heavy river steamer whose engines raised protesting clamor like an assemblage of threshing machines. The gods of the air and water were in a kindly mood, or else she would have opened up and foundered ere now. In the spray-swept wheelhouse stood Captain Michael O'Shea, swaying easily to the crazy roll and lurch of the Hoang Ho, and scanning the low dim coast with a pair of glasses. Clinging to the window ledge beside him was a young man of a Chinese countenance whose raiment, the handiwork of a fashionable British tailor, was sadly rumpled and soiled. The whole aspect of the young man was rumpled, in fact, not to say excessively forlorn, and now and then he pressed his hand against a painful jaw. It was difficult to imagine that he had been an ornament of clubs, a pattern for the gilded youth, and the smartest comprador between Tientsin and Singapore. The plight of Charlie Tong Sin was made poignantly distressing by the fact that in the process of acquiring the vices of the Occident he had lost his grip on the essential virtues of the Orient. His native stoicism had been sapped, and the fatalistic attitude of mind which meets death without so much as the flutter of an eyelid was eaten with dry rot. In other words, the comprador was willing to pay any price to save his own skin, although his father before him would have suffered himself to be sliced to death by inches sooner than lose face in the presence of a foreigner. Captain Michael O'Shea's method of extracting information from this kidnapped passenger had been brutally simple and direct. Charlie Tong Sin was informed that he could make a clean breast of it or be thrown overboard. And the shipmaster, when he was thoroughly in earnest, had a way of conveying the impression that he meant what he said. He believed that he knew his man. The comprador was strongly reluctant to have his head lopped off by the sword of a native executioner, which was very likely to happen if this terrible O'Shea should turn him over to the Chinese authorities. Given the promise of immunity in exchange for a confession, he could flee to Japan or the Straits settlements and live handsomely in the society of other Chinese exiles. With the funds that he had piled up during his brief and brilliant business career. Likewise there would be opportunities in shipping and commerce for a comprador of his uncommon ability. "I would honestly enjoy killing you, Charlie," said Captain O'Shea as they stood together in the wheelhouse of the Huang Ho. "You are a smart lad, but ye got too gay with me, and you overplayed your game when ye slipped under the counter of this steamer in a sampan in the dark of the night, and got busy with the red paint. That sort of silly jugglery was the Chinese of it, I suppose. Now, I have tried to make it plain that your life is not worth a pinch of snuff to any one of us. There is not a man in the ship that wants to lay eyes on Shanghai ever again. They will be only too glad to quit the country if they have the price in their pockets, and I will give them the price. So ye must not hold to the notion that we are afraid of getting in trouble on your account. I am worth more to you alive than if I am dead," sullenly muttered Charlie Tong Sin. "Is it not so? You think I will be handy as a pilot, as an interpreter? I have been doing a deuce of a lot of thinking. I am no fool, Captain O'Shea. I know pretty well when I am licked. I made a botch of it in Shanghai. You went blundering about like a buffalo, and I thought it was a cinch to get you out of the way. 'Twas the luck of the Irish that pulled me through," said O'Shea. "Now we understand each other, Charlie, me lad. I am staking all I have, me life and me money, to get to the bottom of this infernal secret society you have mixed yourself up with. 'Tis an instrument I am for the good of humanity. And if yet turn state's evidence to enable me to make a clean, thorough job of it, I think I am justified in giving you a chance to hot-foot it out of China. Let us call it a bargain, Captain O'Shea. As we used to say in New York, I am up against it good and plenty. To commit suicide, as many Chinese would do in a fix like this, is all tommyrot." Charlie Tong Sin could have no more gin cocktails. "What? You can begin the confession right away," exclaimed the shipmaster. "One thing at a time," cheerfully replied the comprador. "I will take you to the river of 10,000 evil smells and the village of Wang Lifu. Then you will find many very interesting things to ask me to talk about. And ye hope to give me the slip in the meantime." And Captain O'Shea showed no ill will. "Very well, Charlie. One thing at a time. Now, take these glasses and have a look at the coast. By my reckoning, we are far enough to the north'ard to begin to haul inshore." The Huang Ho was laboring abeam of a monotonous expanse of marshy islands and ragged shoals, made by the silt of river floods. The shifting channels were poorly charted, for trade sought the inland waterways. The fact that the Taiyan steamer, with McDougall and Jim Eldridge on board, had somehow found a passage leading from the sea, convinced Captain O'Shea that he could do likewise with a considerably smaller vessel. Charlie Tong Sin had admitted that he knew the way in, and he was no more anxious to be drowned than the rest of the company. "With good luck we can scrape over the sandbars on the afternoon tide," said the comprador, "and anchor in deep water for the night. I cannot show you where to go in the dark. There are no lights." The Huang Ho edged steadily nearer the coast. Her crew gazed ahead at the frothing breakers that tumbled over the far-extended shoals, and appeared unhappy. By a miracle their steamer was still under them after struggling through rough winds and high seas, and now they were to be wrecked, so all signs indicated, in a god-forsaken region of sand and swamp and mud. However, there was no whimpering. Captain O'Shea, their overlord, had a trick of knocking a man down and then listening to his complaints. And he was as ready with a word of commendation as he was with his disciplinary fists. "Mr. Kittredge, if we hit bottom, put it to her and jam her over," he remarked to the chief engineer. "A chum of mine by the name of Johnny Kent that sailed with me and held your berth used to clamp his safety valves when he had urgent need of steam. Did ya ever try it?" "God forbid," fervently ejaculated Mr. Kittredge. "But in this crazy tub a man will do anything. If you find yourself flyin' to glory with a section of a boiler pokin' in the small of your back, don't lay it against me, sir. I like the way ye talk, Mr. Kittredge. Stand by your engines, if ye please, for we will be in the white water before long." The Hoang Ho sheered to one side and shouldered past the outermost shoals. O'Shea took the wheel. And Charlie Tong Sin, cool and quick-witted, told him how to follow the turbid, twisting channel that wound its course between the sea and the wide mouth of the estuary. More than once the steamer scraped the oozy bottom, hung and shivered while the breakers pounded her, and then stubbornly forged ahead, timbers groaning, boilers hissing, propeller kicking up clouds of mud astern. It was evident that the channel had shoaled in places since any other steamer had made the passage, and it was not at all certain that the Hoang Ho could stand the strain of forcing her way to sea again. "I have not been here since 2 years ago," said the comprador. "It is worse than I expected, you bet. Aio, a man that sails with you dies a dozen deaths, Captain O'Shea. I find it more comfortable than living in the best hotel in Shanghai," very pointedly returned the shipmaster, as he climbed the spokes of the big wooden wheel with hands and feet and wrenched the Hoang Ho clear of a hungry sand spit. By now she was fairly in the midst of the marshy islands that extended from the watery mainland. The violence of the surf was broken and the tide moved in broad, sluggish currents. Mr. Parkinson, who was swinging the sounding lead, shouted that the channel had deepened to 5 fathoms. The steamer had survived the passage. 2 miles farther inland she let go anchor in a wide lagoon. The afternoon had waned. A cloudy twilight was closing down. On every hand stretched a flat, unbroken region of swamp and creeks and rivers. No villages were visible nor groves of trees against the skyline to mark the situation of a temple. A few small fishing boats with ragged sails fled at sight of the foreign steamer. The comprador waved his hand to starboard and exclaimed, "Yonder it is, the river of 10,000 evil smells, as you call it in English. Wait till the tide goes down, and you will find out pretty quick why the Chinese give it that funny name." "'Tis a filthy-looking country," quoth Captain O'Shea. "It looks like one great big sewer, with the yellow water and the sludge and the slime on the banks. It was all very well drained one time, long ago," explained Charlie Tong Sin. "Then there were many people and towns. The Taipings destroyed the canals and played the dickens with everything. And nothing has been repaired, so the people don't live here anymore." "And where is this place called Wang Lifu?" demanded O'Shea. 6 miles up that stinking river." "You think you will see the painted joss tomorrow, Captain? The stinking river and the painted joss. You are loosening up, Charlie." I am near the end of me journey when you say things like that. I have heard of them before. Two other foreign men only to have seen the painted Joss, and it was unfortunate for them. The comprador said this softly and with an evil grin. He had overstepped the mark. Captain O'Shea gripped him by the neck and shook him savagely as he thundered in his ear. Any more of that, and I will forget the bargain we made. One of those men was a friend of mine. And by rights I ought to drill ye with a bullet as a favor to him. Between chattering teeth Charlie Tong Sin, suddenly abject, begged for his life. Presently he moved restlessly from one deck to another, but always a man followed and kept watch of him, as Captain O'Shea had ordered. The ship's company, most of them off duty and wearied with the stress and hardships of the voyage, gathered under an awning stretched between the deck houses and talked in low tones. This melancholy, empty landscape had a quality curiously depressing. With the falling tide the swamps and the muddy banks were laid bare and the air became foul and heavy with the smell of decayed vegetation, of ooze, of dead fish. The ebb and flow of salt water failed to cleanse and sweeten these sluggish streams and stagnant lagoons and abandoned canals. The men who had followed Captain O'Shea to this place were no longer so many vagabonds and failures struggling for survival. They had been welded together. In a way, they were an organization with something like esprit de corps and could be depended on to act as a unit. Such a feeling as this brings to life dead self-respect and shattered confidence. They knew not at all what the morrow might bring forth, but every one of them was anxious to play the man, to stand the test, to redeem himself in his own sight, to justify Captain O'Shea's faith in him. It was not a night to invite sleep. The adventurers felt the immense loneliness of this loathsome anchorage. It was unlike the populous China which they had hitherto known. One might believe, with the natives, that ghosts and demons had power to curse and blast a region in which some violation of the feng shui, or sacred rites of wind and water, had angered the supernatural influences. The breeze died to a dead calm. The lifeless air reeked with the stench from the mouth of the river of 10,000 evil smells. It was drawing toward midnight when Mr. Kittredge came on deck and said to Captain O'Shea, who was sitting with a group of his men, "I shall have to start the pumps, sir. The vessel is leakin' much worse than when I first reported it. I was hoping we could lay her on a beach after we have finished our business up the river and caulk her plates," replied the master of the Huang. "Ho, is she making water faster than you can handle it, Mr. Kittredge? She acts to me as if a plate dropped clean out of her a few minutes ago, sir. The pumps may help, but I have a notion that the whole rotten, blankety river is runnin' into her." Captain O'Shea jumped below and was promptly convinced that the gloomy diagnosis of the chief engineer had a large basis of fact. The water was fairly rushing into the holds and gurgling over the ballast. Likely enough, the battering passage in from sea had sheared and wrenched away enough rusty rivets to weaken the junction of two or more plates, and they had been unable any longer to withstand the pressure. It really made no difference whether or not this theory was the correct one. The fact was that the venerable Huang Ho had suddenly decided to lay her bones in the mud with 6 fathoms of water above her keel. Mr. Kittredge pensively caressed his grey whiskers and remarked with a sigh, "I mentioned the pumps from force of habit. It's really ridiculous to stay below any longer, Captain. We gave the bloody old tub more than she could stand, and she's peacefully chucked it up. She's sinkin' very quiet and decent, I'll say that for her. 'Tis time we said goodbye to her, quoth O'Shea. Draw your fires, if you can, Mr. Kittredge, and I will get the boats ready. I do seem to find trouble wherever I go, sadly, murmured the chief engineer. The men on deck took the news with no great show of excitement. This was the kind of voyage which one could not reasonably expect to be commonplace. To have to escape from a sinking steamer was an episode, not a disaster. In few words, Captain O'Shea assured them that he had no intention of letting this uncomfortable little happening interfere with the business for which he had employed them. The insurance underwriters would be out of pocket. But who cared a rap for them, anyhow? Thereupon, he issued orders, swiftly, intelligently, with masterful vehemence. The two boats which appeared most serviceable were swung outboard and held ready to launch. They would hold a dozen men each without crowding. Water kegs were filled, the galley and storeroom ransacked for tins of meat and biscuit, bags of potatoes and rice. The firearms and cutlasses were served out and the cases of ammunition divided between the two boats. Meanwhile, the Hoang Ho continued to sink with a certain dignity and decorum. One could find nothing dramatic in this shipwreck. Everyone moved with haste, but there was no outcry. Only one mischance marred the exodus from the Hoang Ho. All hands were absorbed, and quite naturally, in delaying their departure as little as possible. Delay meant something worse than wet feet. In fact, the main deck was almost level with the water when the boats were ready to shove clear. For once the Hoang Ho had moved rapidly, although in a lamentable direction. With so much to do in so short a time, it was not extraordinary that the vigilant espionage which surrounded Charlie Tong Sin should be relaxed, not to say forgotten, for a moment. Even Captain O'Shea neglected to keep an eye on him, the business of abandoning ship on a dark night at excessively short notice being calculated to tax the resources of the most capable commander. The comprador took advantage of these distractions to erase himself from the scene. The boats were held against the side of the steamer, while the captain took tally of the men in them, scrambling from one boat to the other with a globe lantern swinging in his fist. Charlie Tong Sin was indubitably missing. O'Shea leaped on board the moribund Hoang Ho, which was now sobbing and gurgling tremendously, and made a flying search of the cabins and staterooms. It was obvious that this elusive young Chinese had not vanished below decks, where by now nothing but a fish could exist. And unless Captain Michael O'Shea wished to join the fishes, it was time for him to go. Chagrined and anxious, he returned to his boat. And the men frantically plied oars. A moment or two later the Hoang Ho went under with very little fuss, meeting her end with the calm of a Chinese philosopher. The boats rocked in the waves that rolled away from the place where she had been, and the rays of the lanterns revealed many large and greasy bubbles. Captain O'Shea wasted no time in sentimental regrets. The Hoang Ho was a dead issue. What vitally concerned him was the whereabouts of that valuable passenger, Charlie Tong Sin. It was absurd to suppose that he had fallen overboard and given up the ghost. A rascal of his kidney had as many lives as a cat. It was much more plausible to surmise that he had unostentatiously laid hold of a life belt, slipped over the stern, and made for the nearest shore. The boats moved to and fro, looking for him, but the darkness, misty and opaque, made it hopeless to discover the head of a swimmer who, by this time, might have left the water and concealed himself in the marsh. "I misdoubt that me policy was sound," said Captain O'Shea to Mr. Kittredge. "Maybe I ought to have shot him, anyhow. It would ha' been a good job," grunted the chief engineer. "And now he'll streak it for this village of Wang Lifu and give an alarm." "Precisely that. But unless he can pick up a sampan or a fishing boat, he will make slow headway, floundering through the swamps and swimming the creeks. 'Tis up to us to beat him to it." Mr. Parkinson, who was in command of the other boat, was ordered to steer alongside for consultation. It was promptly agreed that the party should first find the mouth of the river of 10,000 evil smells and then move upstream without delay. It would be slow and blundering navigation, but if 3 or 4 miles could be traversed before daylight, they might tie up to the bank and reconnoitre within striking distance of their goal. "I do not know what kind of a mess we will hop into," O'Shea told them before the boats separated. "We may have to fight our way, thanks to that slippery devil of a comprador, and I am not asking yet to go anywhere that I will not go myself. Some of you are not trained to use weapons, but if ye will cut loose and blaze away and not think too much about your own skins, we can make it uncomfortable for a slather of Chinese. There is plenty of ammunition, so don't scrimp yourselves." The boat slid slowly into the entrance of the wide, sluggish stream. The lanterns were extinguished. The only sound was the cadenced thump of the thole pins. If any of the men felt the prickly chill of cowardice, they kept it to themselves. Now and then the keels furrowed the mud, and when the boats stranded hard and fast, the crews waded overboard and shoved them ahead. Thus the little flotilla progressed until dawn flushed the eastern sky and the vapors, streaming upward from the marshes, curled and drifted like filmy clouds. Higher ground and the green, checkered squares of tilled fields were discernible a short distance beyond. The boats turned into the mouth of a tiny creek, where the tall rushes curtained them from observation. This was a favorable halting place, and a cold breakfast was hastily eaten. O'Shea had a poor opinion of fighting on an empty stomach. He addressed himself with marked deference to a very neatly dressed man with iron grey hair who had said little during the voyage. His face was haggard, and his eyes were tired with weariness of living. "You have seen service, sir, and ye have led drilled men," said O'Shea. "The cards are dealt. But from now on you can play them better than I. I will be obliged to ye for advice." The cashiered officer looked grateful. This kind of recognition had power to move him. With a diffident manner, as if his professional opinion had long since ceased to interest anyone, he replied, "Most Chinese villages are walled. There will be at least one gate facing the river and 2 or 3 on the inland side. It is often awkward to make a landing under fire from boats. I suggest we divide our force. If you approve, Captain, I will take 10 of the most active men and disembark here. We can fetch a wide circuit of the town, and it will not be difficult to make our way across the rice fields and ditches. You can put the rest of them in one boat and row up in front of the town, wading in the stream until we are in a position to make a rush. Then we will drive home a simultaneous attack in front and rear." "Napoleon could not beat it," heartily exclaimed O'Shea. and if ye shoot fast enough and kick up a terrible racket, they will think ye are an army. What will the signal be? 3 rifle shots. Aye, Mr. Bannister. 'Tis the sensible plan. That ye take command of the army while I hoist the Rear Admiral's pennant over the navy. We have no reserves, but many a famous victory would have been missing from history if the lads that won them had waited for the reserves to come up. The chosen 10 forsook the boats and tramped off behind their soldierly leader. A few minutes later, the expedition of Captain O'Shea got under way, his boat hugging the muddy shore and dodging behind its ragged indentations. It was not long before a wide curve of the river disclosed to view the tiled roofs, the crumbling brick wall, and the towered gateways of a village. In front of it were several rickety wharfs, or stagings, built of bamboo poles, lashed together. At the outer end of one of these lay a 2-mast junk, her hawse holes painted to resemble 2 huge eyes. The tide had begun to ebb, and the junk was already heeled so that her deck sloped toward the river. This craft appeared to be deserted. No pigtailed heads bobbed behind the immensely heavy bulwarks. If the army officer had been a Napoleon, Captain O'Shea showed himself a Nelson. Pull like blazes for the junk yonder, he shouted to his men. We will pile aboard her and take cover. The junk was directly in front of the gateway in the village wall, and perhaps 100 yards distant from it. The intervening space was beach, a miry roadway, and a disorderly row of shanties made of driftwood, with a few boats hauled out for repairs. The heavy timbers of the junk made her a nautical fortress, and the high sides would be difficult of direct assault. The men swung lustily at the oars, and the boat shot out into the open river. O'Shea steered wide of the village until he could turn and make directly for the junk. It was an admirable bit of strategy, but wholly wasted on this sleepy, shabby Chinese village. There was never a sign of a hostile demonstration. As an anticlimax, the thing was absurd. A crowd of men, women, and children streamed out through the gate in the wall and stared with much excited chatter at the foreign invaders. Apparently, their behavior meant no more than a harmless curiosity. Several garrulous old gentlemen squatted upon fragments of timber and pulled at their bamboo pipes while they discussed the singular visitation, with the oracular demeanor of so many owls. The bold O'Shea grinned sheepishly. His sensations were those of a man who beheld a heroic enterprise suddenly turned into low comedy. He glanced at the amused faces of his followers and said, "'Tis not what ye might call a desperate resistance. Let us promenade ashore and look the town over." They quitted their fortress and moved along the narrow, swaying staging of bamboo, their rifles ready for use in the event of an ambuscade. The Chinese crowd promptly retreated in noisy confusion. O'Shea ordered a halt. After some delay, 3 signal shots came down the wind from Major Bannister's force. He was about to attack the village from the landward side. Now the shopkeepers and coolies scuttled madly away from O'Shea's party to seek shelter within the walls and discover what all this extraordinary excitement could mean. Behind them tramped the naval brigade into streets from which the inhabitants were vanishing as rapidly as possible. Somewhere near the center of the town, O'Shea and Major Bannister joined forces. This pair of valiant leaders eyed each other with mutually puzzled chagrin. "We just walked in without the slightest trouble," confessed the army man. "What do you make of it?" "I had the same experience," observed O'Shea. and I do not know what to make of it at all. 'Twas me firm conviction that we were prancin' into a hornet's nest. The information all pointed that way. I would call it a funny kind of a surprise party. The villagers have no intention of making it unpleasant for us. They have been giving my men eggs and melons and chickens, to keep us good-natured, I presume. Well, we will find quarters and fetch our grub from the junk, and I will buy the drinks, if ya can locate them, for the joke seems to be on me. They found the village tavern, consisting of several detached buildings set in a large courtyard. The agitated landlord kowtowed himself almost black in the face, and in trembling accents expressed his desire to bestow all his goods upon the warlike foreigners if only his miserable life might be spared. He summarily ejected a few native guests of low degree, who fled without delaying to argue the matter. The invaders set the tavern coolies to sweeping and scrubbing the filthy buildings and took charge of the kitchen with its row of earthen fire pots. There was no lack of room for men to sleep 3 and 4 in a row upon the kayangs, or brick platforms used for the purpose, and the ragged quilts were hung outside to air. In short, the tavern was transformed into a camp which had no serious discomforts. Having taken care of his men, Captain O'Shea found leisure to ponder over the situation, a process which left him with a headache. He rambled unmolested from one end of the village to the other, searching for clues that might link themselves with the painted Joss and the tragedy of Bill Maguire. There were 2 small, dilapidated temples, one of them inhabited by a few Buddhist priests in yellow robes. O'Shea was permitted to enter them and explore to his heart's content. They were nothing more than village shrines, however, in which the perfunctory rites were held and offerings made, such places as might have been seen in 1,000 Chinese towns. Nor did the village itself, excepting for an air of general decay, differ from the hamlets of a dozen provinces. I have a harrowing suspicion that Charlie Tong Sin made a monkey of me, ruefully sighed O'Shea. Or maybe I have been all wrong from the start. The Chinese proposition has too many twists in it for a white man to fathom. As a person of considerable confidence in his ability to master difficulties, his self-esteem had been dealt a hard blow. His imagination had pictured a large, stirring climax of his pilgrimage, and here he was all adrift in a wretched little village of no consequence whatever, the last place in the world to find the headquarters of a secret organization so mysteriously powerful as to cast its sinister shadow throughout China, and even across the seas. And yet the evidence had been by no means vague and misleading. Beginning with the fragmentary revelations of the demented sailor, coming next to the disclosures of poor MacDougall's diary, he had been led straight to the town of Wanglifu, on the river of 10,000 evil smells. He had felt that the hand of destiny was guiding him. Returning to the tavern yard, O'Shea found his men cheerfully making friends of the villagers and accepting the situation with the ready adaptability of true soldiers of fortune. They looked to the leader for orders, but he had none to give them. He had been placed in the ridiculous position of providing wages and rations for a perfectly superfluous expeditionary force. Just what did you expect to turn up in this pigsty of a settlement? Gloomily inquired Mr. Kittredge, who seemed disappointed that he had not broken a few heads. Whatever it was, it fell flat. It did that, frankly admitted O'Shea. 'Tis a painful subject, Mr. Kittredge, and we will not discuss it now. But I am not done with the riddle of Wanglifu. 3 days passed, and singly and in squads the invaders ransacked the village and its suburbs, poking into shops, alleys, dwellings, and courtyards, and taking stock of the inmates thereof. That the people were very poor and very industrious was all that one could say of them. And they were no more to be suspected of plotting deeds of violence than so many rabbits. Doggedly persistent, unwilling to confess himself beaten, O'Shea shifted his quest to the open country for miles outside of Wanglifu. It was a region of green fields gridironed with ditches and rutted paths, and dotted with toilers in blue cotton blouses and straw hats, who tilled their crops from dawn to dark. It was obviously useless to extend the investigation any considerable distance away from this region. If the secret was not to be unearthed in the vicinity of Wanglifu, then his conclusions had been all wrong. The villagers assured him that this was, in truth, none other than Wanglifu, and the baffled, perplexed O'Shea could not let go of the opinion that the goal was somewhere near at hand. Otherwise, why all the elaborate stratagems in Shanghai to thwart his voyage to the River of 10,000 evil smells? He had imagined himself attacking a stronghold of some sort, a headquarters of desperate criminals who must be wiped out. But if that slippery comprador, Charlie Tong Sin, had carried a warning to the men of the Painted Joss, he must have fled elsewhere than to this commonplace, harmless village. At any rate, it seemed absurd to tarry much longer in Wanglifu with a force of armed retainers. At the end of a fortnight, O'Shea was of the opinion that his loyal legion had better seek to mend its fortunes in some other quarter. He was ashamed to look them in the face. The fiasco cut him to the quick. He had been as mad as poor Bill McGuire. In future he would stick to his trade as a shipmaster. Meanwhile, the malarial poison of the marshes found its way into his blood. He failed to realize that he was ill, and paid no attention to the little flashes of fever that came by night and the creeping, chilly feeling that troubled him in the morning. There came a day when he was unable to rise from the brick sleeping platform. The fever increased suddenly, violently. It caught him unprepared. His plan of retreat had not been announced, and now he was incapable of leadership. His mind alternated between delirium and stupor. When he talked, it was of many inconsequential things. One might have said that the evil spirit of the Painted Joss had laid its spell of misfortune upon him. In the courtyard of the tavern his lieutenants held a conference. Can anybody make head or tail of this infernal situation? Gloomily inquired Mr. Kittredge. What in Hades are we going to do about it? Try to pull Captain O'Shea through this fever before we think of anything else, stoutly affirmed Mr. Parkinson. We jammed into this crazy voyage with our eyes shut. With all of us it was anything to get clear of Shanghai. And it's useless business to sit and growl about it as hard luck. What do you say, Major Bannister? The army man smiled at sight of their discouraged countenances and quietly answered. What else can we chaps expect but hard luck? Really, I should be surprised to find anything else. I can tell you one thing, gentlemen. I have campaigned in the tropics, and I know something about this swamp fever. We had best get out of here and take Captain O'Shea with us. If we don't, he will die as sure as sunrise, and the rest of us will be down with it before long. It caught him first because he was fagged with worry. We agree with you there, said Mr. Parkinson. But we seem to have overlooked a line of retreat. That was the Irish of it, I suppose. If we go down river in our 2 boats we'll have to work out to sea over those nasty shoals and then run the chance of being picked up adrift. We might get away with it, but it would kill a man as sick as O'Shea. Why not go upriver, suggested Major Bannister. By means of a few words of Chinese and a great many gestures I have extracted from the village headmen the information that there is a European mission station about 150 miles northwest of here. We can make part of the journey by boat and then hike overland. With a litter and coolies to carry it, we may be able to take Captain O'Shea through alive. It's better than letting him die in this pest hole. That's the most sensible speech I've heard since we signed on, grunted Mr. Kittredge. And you can pull out of this rotten Wang Lifu not a minute too soon to please me. The village headmen were summoned, and these venerable worthies declared themselves anxious to aid the sick leader of the foreign soldiers. He had played with their children, paid the shopkeepers their prices without dispute, and sat with the old men in the tea houses. Nor had his armed force committed any abuses, although they held the village at their mercy. It was wisdom to try to carry Captain O'Shea to his own people. The village would gladly furnish a guide and plenty of coolies, a covered litter, and a small houseboat in which the sick man could be made comfortable. The evacuation of Wang Lifu was a dismal business. The adventurers were oppressed by a sense of failure and discouragement. Their enterprise had fizzled out like a dampened match. This final act was inglorious. Their plight was worse than when they had been stranded as beachcombers in Shanghai. They carried Captain O'Shea to a sampan, or flat-bottomed boat, with a tiny cabin of bamboo and matting, which could be towed against the sluggish current of the river. The men disposed themselves in the 2 boats saved from the Huang Ho steamer, and a squad of half-naked coolies strung themselves along a towing rope to help track the sampan upstream. The sick man lay stretched upon his quilts and showed little interest in the slow progress of the flotilla. Between spells of heavy drowsiness he watched the slimy shore and fringing marsh slide past. Through the first day the wind was cool and the air bright, and the boats trailed upriver until after nightfall, before they were pulled into the bank to moor. As the part of caution, no fires were made and conversation was hushed. The foreigners had an uncomfortable suspicion that this might be hostile territory, although they had discovered nothing to warrant the conjecture. But O'Shea had been babbling about the painted joss while flighty with fever, and Charlie Tong Sin was still unaccounted for. Between midnight and morning the sick man came out of his uneasy dreams. As it seemed to him, he was clear-headed, his senses alert, his judgment normal. Just why he should be cooped up in this native boat was a bit difficult to comprehend, but why try to understand it? There was only one problem of real importance, and now was the time to solve it. O'Shea laughed to think what a stupid, blundering fool he had been to recruit an armed expedition and come clattering into this corner of China with so much fuss and noise. If a man wanted to find the painted joss, all he had to do was listen to the friendly, familiar voices that whispered in his ears. O'Shea could hear them now. He accepted them as a matter of course. His eyes were very bright as he pulled on his shoes and fumbled for the revolver in its holster under the pillow. Curiously enough, he was no longer conscious of great physical weakness. It was tremendously urgent that he should go to find the painted joss without a moment's delay. His men would not understand if he should tell them about the friendly voices that were offering to show him the way. They might try to restrain him. He must leave the boat quietly, unobserved. Crawling from beneath the matting curtain, he gained the river bank. His knees were exceedingly shaky and his hands trembled uncertainly, but he was confident that he had found the trail of the painted Joss and that his vigor would soon return. Charlie Tong-sin outwit him. Nonsense. O'Shea would have been startled beyond measure to know that he was wandering off in delirium. He would have taken a shot at anyone rash enough to tell him so. Undetected he moved along the shore, silent as a Red Indian, and was presently lost in the darkness. It was muddy walking, and he turned into the tall marsh grass, where a carpet of dead vegetation made firmer footing. Frequently he was compelled to halt and regain his labored breath, but his purpose was unwavering. The voices drove him on. He had no sense of fear. After some time his erratic progress led him back to the river. There he stumbled over a log and sat down to wait for daybreak, which had begun to flush the sky. His head throbbed as though hammers were pounding it, and waves of blurring dizziness troubled him. What was more disquieting, the guiding voices had ceased to talk to him. He felt crushing disappointment and sadness. His eyes filled with tears. Dawn found him seated dejectedly with his back propped against the log, his head drooping, while he stared at the muddy river. Here he would wait on the chance that his friends might find him. As the day brightened, his aimless vision was caught by something which powerfully awakened his weary, befogged perceptions. It acted as a stimulant of tremendous force. Sitting bolt upright he gazed at a footprint, cleanly outlined, which had become sun-dried and hardened in a stratum of clay. It had been made by a leather sole and heel. The outline was pointed and narrow. Into O'Shea's quickened memory there flashed the picture of Charlie Tong-sin stretched upon the cabin floor of the Hoang Ho steamer, his patent leather shoes waving gently as he went to sleep under the soporific influence of a knockout blow. He felt absolutely certain that this particular print had been left by the fashionable footgear of the vanished comprador. The voices had guided him aright. It was here that Charlie Tong-sin had come ashore after making his way up the river of 10,000 evil smells in some kind of a native boat. There was one chance in a million that O'Shea should have halted to wait in this precise spot where his eyes might see the thing. He dragged himself to his feet and scanned the melancholy landscape. There were no villages in sight, only the marsh and fields and a vast mound of debris to mark the place where once had stood a city. Even the walls surrounding it had been levelled. It was scarcely more than a widespread excrescence of broken brick and tiling partly overgrown with vegetation. The landscape could have held no more desolate reminder of the wreckage left in the wake of the Taiping rebels. It was plausible to surmise that this was the real Wanglifu, the city which O'Shea had set out to find. The squalid village much lower down the river might have been founded by refugees who gave the same name to their new abode. And the villagers had been too ignorant to explain the blunder. To them there was only one Wanglifu. How Charlie Tong-sin must have laughed at leaving O'Shea and his men to waste themselves in a chase that led nowhere. It was a pallid, unshaven, tottering ghost of Captain Michael O'Shea that mustered strength to walk very slowly in the direction of the ruined city. Once he paused and became irresolute, but a little Way beyond he found the imprint of a narrow shoe of European workmanship on the soft bank of a ditch. His stumbling steps led him, as by an unerring divination, toward the highest part of the great mound of debris where tall trees grew from the crumbling masonry. His painful advance became less difficult when he found a path from which the obstructions had been removed. Presently he stood looking across a cleared space. In the midst of the ruins, invisible from river or highway. In it were several small buildings and one much larger. The timbers set into its walls were carved and gilded, the curving roof of dull red tile. There was no living thing in sight. This isolated community was so situated that it was wholly concealed from strangers, and the natives of the region were apt to shun the blasted city as haunted by demons. No watchers were posted to guard against intrusion. O'Shea crossed the open space and made for the large building, which had the aspect of a temple. Unhesitatingly he approached the massive wooden doors and found them ajar. He walked like a man in a trance, muttering to himself. Passing within, he entered a sort of anteroom partitioned by means of screens wonderfully embroidered. The stone pavement rang to the tread of his heels. The place echoed with emptiness. He pressed on and came into a room of greater extent. Its corners were lost in shadow. Rows of pillars supported the dusky rafters upon which gilded dragons seemed to writhe. The windows were small and set close to the roof, and the light of early morning had not dispelled the gloom. In the center of the floor was an altar. Behind it towered an image of Buddha, and yet it was unlike the images of the bland and contemplative Buddha commonly to be found in the temples of the East. It was a monstrous thing. Only an artist with an inspiration from the devil could have so handled tools as to make those wooden features seem to lust after all abominable wickedness. The color of this seated statue was crimson. Amid the shadows it glowed like fire or blood. On the breast, above the folded arms, stood out in broad, black strokes a Chinese symbol or character which O'Shea recognized with a sensation of creeping repugnance. The painted joss, he gasped. His attention was so strongly caught and held by this malevolent image that for the moment he had eyes for nothing else. Presently, however, he became aware that another figure confronted him, a living presence. It was a man sitting in a massive chair of teak wood, by the side of the Buddha. The bulk of him was enormous. He was both fat and mighty of frame, and not even the towering amplitude of the image could dwarf his proportions and belittle the impression he conveyed. His face was broad and heavy-jowled, the mouth sensual and cruel. With folded arms he sat and gazed at the foreign intruder. This unflinching, scornful immobility had a certain distinction. He believed that he must instantly die at the hands of this European with the white, savage face and the blazing eyes who covered him with a revolver. It was futile to cry out and summon help. As is customary with Chinese in positions of authority, this high priest of iniquity had gone to the temple to have audience with his servitors very early in the morning. They had not yet joined him, and O'Shea was quick to read his own advantage. It was right and just that he should slay this huge man in the crimson robe who ruled the temple of the painted joss. He had come 10,000 miles to be judge and executioner. He was ready to kill and be killed in his turn. But the revolver was strangely heavy, and it wavered so that he was unable to hold it at arm's length. A haze bothered his vision and he could not brush it from his eyes. Something was the matter with his knees. They were giving way. With an incoherent exclamation, O'Shea fell unconscious upon the stone flagging and the revolver clattered from his limp hand. He had paid the price of exertion beyond his strength. When his senses returned there was in his mind only the dimmest recollection of how he came to be in this dreadful place. The vagaries of fever no longer possessed him. Clear-headed but wretchedly weak and nerveless, he gazed about him and discovered that he was alone in the unholy temple. The shadows were not so heavy on the pillars, the gilded rafters, and the marble altar. The crimson image of the seated Buddha loomed flamboyant and portentous, and the Chinese symbol painted on its breast was boldly outlined. There was no way of escape. The building was a most effectual prison. His revolver had been taken from him. He could not even fight and die like a man. The fact was that this desperate extremity lacked the proper sense of reality. It was so contrary to reason, and he had such shadowy, confused ideas of what had preceded, that this was more like nightmare or delirium. And it seemed impossible that he should not presently find himself awake. What most tenaciously persisted in his memory was the image of the huge man in the teak wood chair. He was a vision which could not be denied. Such a one as he had power to sway the wills of others to his desires, to create and direct great enterprises, and send his influence afar, but never for good. If he ordered murder done in distant places, his secret edicts would be obeyed, nor would his agent dare to thwart him. If there was such an organization as O'Shea had assumed, then he had stood face to face with the dominant personality, the compelling force from which radiated infernal activities. I saw him, whether I am myself or somebody else, the prisoner muttered with a groan. And he will come back and the brand will be chopped into me, same as was done to poor Bill McGuire. 'Tis a tough finish, if all this is really true. My God, I wish I knew what had happened to me yesterday. I was going upriver with me men, and now. He struggled to his feet. A supreme effort of will conquered physical weakness. A man condemned to die is capable of forgetting bodily ills. Just then a young man appeared from the direction of the doorway. He wore native garments, but O'Shea recognized him. It was Charlie Tong Sin, whose smile was unpleasant. In his hand was O'Shea's revolver, which he was careful to hold ready for use. The jaunty, affable manner of the comprador had returned. He appeared very well satisfied with himself, as he exclaimed, by way of greeting, "It is an unexpected pleasure, you bet, Captain O'Shea. I have waited till you were gone from Wang Lifu. It was reported that you were very sick and went up the river yesterday with your men. You decided to come and see us, to visit the painted Joss. You wished to make some trouble. 'Tis the last day I will make trouble for anyone." "By the looks of things," replied O'Shea, "you win, Charlie." "You are a smart man," grinned the other. "But you had too much curiosity. I am a good fellow. I will tell you what you want to know. You will not give it away. They are getting ready to cut your visit pretty short." There was the chatter of voices somewhere outside, and the brazen mutter of a gong. O'Shea kept silence. He was not as resigned to his fate as Charlie Tong Sin inferred. He was watching every motion of the gloating young man, and his eyes measured the distance between them. "You will feel better if you know," tauntingly. cried the Chinese. You have seen the painted Joss. You have seen a man sitting beside it, the great and terrible Chung himself, the ruler of the Pih Lin Kiao, the sect of the fatal obligation. Much obliged, Charlie, grimly interrupted. O'Shea. Tell me some more. I am sorry I could not have words with the terrible Chung. And the brand that ye chop into people, your trademark. It is the mark that means the dreadful messenger of Chung. It is a favor to tell you, Captain O'Shea. No other foreigner, no Chinese except the servants of Chung, have heard it spoken. But you will not speak it anywhere. There's more that I want to know, said O'Shea. Though precious little good the information will do me. Ha! Why did you not have so much sense before? And mind your own business. It was absurd to carry on such a dialogue as this. As O'Shea perceived, but Charlie Tong Sin was enjoying this session with the rash shipmaster who had formerly held the upper hand. Before the victim could be subjected to further taunts, he heard the massive doors opened and other sounds to indicate that bars were sliding into place to fasten them on the inside. The huge man in the crimson robe, the great and terrible Chung, lumbered into view and seated himself in the chair of teak wood. Charlie Tong Sin humbly bowed several times. The personage beckoned the twain nearer and spoke briefly. He desired to conduct a cross-examination of his own, with the comprador as interpreter. He wishes to know why you have come to this place, was the first question addressed to O'Shea. Because ye butchered a friend of mine, a red-headed sailor by the name of Jim Eldridge, was the unflinching reply. He told me about your dirty devilment as well as he could, and I saw what ye did to him. The huge man showed signs of consternation when this was conveyed to him. He uttered a bellowing interrogation. He is not alive? You have talked with his ghost? Shrilly demanded Charlie Tong Sin. 'Twas him that sent me here, declared O'Shea. Ye can impart it to the big ugly mug yonder that I have had visits from the ghost of the red-headed sailor that he killed and branded. With an excited, heedless gesture, Charlie Tong Sin raised the revolver. He had been long accustomed to wearing European clothes, and the flowing sleeves of his Chinese outer garment impeded his motions. A fold of the silk fabric fell over the butt of the weapon, and he tried to brush it aside with his left hand. This other sleeve was caught and held for a moment by the sharp firing pin of the cocked hammer. This trifling mishap gave O'Shea a desperate opportunity. With a flash of his normal agility he leaped across the intervening space. The comprador strove frantically to free the weapon, but only entangled it the more. The episode was closed. Before the crimson-robed personage could play a part, O'Shea's shoulder rammed Charlie Tong Sin and sent him sprawling, and the revolver was instantly wrested from his grasp. The doors are locked, panted O'Shea, and before your men break in, I will send the both of ye to hell. Sit where you are, ye terrible Chung. You overplayed your game, Charlie. The comprador seemed to shrink within his clothes. His mouth hung open and his face was ashen. He was eager to clutch at any straw which might give him the chance of life. Shrinking from the scowling presence in the chair, he began to talk. A sing-song babble of words that tumbled over each other. I will help you get away alive if you do not kill me. Captain O'Shea, I will explain about Jim Eldridge, I will not lie to you. All the secrets I will tell you. There was a steamer, the Taiyan, and she came over the bar from the sea in a big storm. At the time of a flood, it was do this or go to the bottom because the engines had broke. A boat with sailors rowed up the river. They were foolish men, who believed the stories that gold and silver treasure was hidden in the ruins of this old Wang Lifu. And they found this temple, and they knew too much. All but two of the men were able to run quick to the river, but Eldridge and one named MacDougall ran into this place, trying to hide. They ran into the temple before they were captured. There was a little building, but now it is ashes and much stakes of burnt wood. In that building those two men were locked to be killed next day. The red-headed man was a demon, I tell you. Walls could not hold him. In the night he set fire to the building, and it was a great blaze. But he was caught and punished. Ye left him for dead, and he came to, growled O'Shea. And so MacDougall got away. I can tell you more secrets, wailed Charlie Tong Sin, but his services as an informer were suddenly cut short. The huge man in the chair had raised his voice in a tremendous call for help to his followers without. Otherwise he had sat composed, glaring at O'Shea. It was his hand that slew Charlie Tong Sin as a traitor. He was on his feet, the heavy chair raised aloft. He swung it with amazing ease. It was no longer a massive article of furniture, but a missile in the hands of a man of gigantic strength. His movements were not clumsy. The chair flew through the air. O'Shea dodged. But Charlie Tong Sin flung up his arms, taken unawares. The impact would have brained an ox. The whirling mass of teak smote the terrified comprador on the head and chest, and he crumpled to the pavement. He was as dead as though he had been caught beneath the hammer of a pile driver. The tableau was an extraordinary one. O'Shea stood staring at the broken body of the young Chinese. The man in the crimson robe stirred not from his tracks, implacable, unafraid. He had executed the last sentence of the sect of the fatal obligation. The people outside were clamoring at the doors. And O'Shea heard the thud and crash of some kind of an improvised battering ram. He sighed and found the thought of death at their hands very bitter. But he would not go alone. He faced the great and terrible Chung and slowly raised the revolver. The arch-assassin bade him wait with a gesture so imperious, so mandatory, that O'Shea hesitated. The bearing of the man held some large significance. His dark, evil countenance expressed rather sadness than wrath. He slid a hand into the folds of his robe and raised the hand to his mouth. Whatever it was that he swallowed wrought its work with swift and deadly virulence. Swaying like a tree about to fall, he strode to the marble altar and fell across it with his head buried in his arms. In this posture he died, in front of the image of the glowing Buddha, whose graven lineaments seemed to express the unholy ambitions and emotions of his own soul. O'Shea managed to walk to a corner of the temple and slumped down upon a marble bench where the painted joss cast its deepest shadow. His strength had ebbed again. Listlessly, almost inattentive, he heard the assault upon the doors renewed and the splintering of plank. When the Chinese mob came tumbling in, he could try to shoot straight and hit a few of them, and then they would close in on him. It was the end of the game. A few minutes and the servitors of Chung came jostling and shouting through the anteroom. Then they halted abruptly. Their noise was hushed. The light that fell from the windows near the roof showed them the lifeless figure in the crimson robe, doubled across the marble altar. In the foreground, lay the battered body of Charlie Tong Sin, but they had eyes only for the tragedy of the altar. They stood dumbfounded, like men in the presence of something incredible. At length the boldest shuffled forward. The others followed timidly. They appeared terrified in the extreme. It was as though they had believed their master to be invulnerable. And he was dead. Possibly they conjectured that he had been slain by an agency more than mortal. The group of Chinese clustered about the altar, whispering, regarding the body of Chung. Apparently they had not bethought themselves of the foreigner who was held a prisoner in the temple. O'Shea rose in his shadowy corner and moved wearily past the painted joss. It was better to have the thing finished. He came upon the Chinese like an apparition. Their wits were so fuddled that the sight of him had the effect of another shock. If he had been powerful enough to slay the mighty Chung, then the demons were his allies. Perceiving their dazed condition, he forbore to shoot, and advanced abreast of the altar. The path to the doorway was clear, but he had not the strength to make a run for it. The hope of life, miraculously restored to him, was in the possibility that they might stand and gaze at him a little longer. He had walked a half-dozen steps farther when one of the crowd yelled. The spell was broken. They raced after him like wolves. He turned and steadied himself and pulled trigger until the revolver was empty. The onset was checked and thrown into bloody confusion. O'Shea had summarily convinced them that whether or not the demons were in league with him, the devil was in this ready weapon of his. They were no longer massed between him and the exit, and for the moment the advantage undeniably belonged to this mysterious, devastating foreigner. He stumbled over the broken timbers of the doors and was in the blessed daylight, the temple behind him. He would be overtaken ere he could flee the ruined city, but he reloaded the revolver as he followed the path at a staggering trot. The mob poured out of the temple, yelping in high-keyed chorus. As a foot racer, the hapless Captain Michael O'Shea was in excessively poor condition. In fact, it promised to be the easiest kind of a matter to overtake him and leisurely pelt him to death with bricks as soon as he should have expended his ammunition. He swerved from the rough path and crawled to the top of a low ridge of debris. Standing erect for a moment, he pitched forward and fell against a bit of wall. His figure had been outlined against the sky, and it was discerned in a fleeting glimpse by a scattered band of men in khaki and linen clothes who were tramping the marsh. They raised a shout and rushed toward the ruined city, converging until the force was mobilized within a short distance of the prostrate O'Shea. The Chinese mob, pursuing full tilt, found itself confronting a score and more of rifles which enthusiastically opened fire until the air hummed with bullets. There was a hasty, unanimous retreat of the followers of Chung to the temple and the adjacent buildings. Major Bannister halted to bend over O'Shea and say, "We thought you were drowned or bogged in the marsh. What sort of a rumpus is this?" "The painted joss," murmured O'Shea. "I found it. Don't bother with me. Go to it and clean out the place." The adventurers, at last earning their wages, proceeded to make things most unpleasant for the household of Chung. The resistance was brief, and those who were not penned within the temple fled in panic and sought cover in the marsh. They were taken by surprise, for the community had found the visit of Captain O'Shea sufficient to engage its attention. To him returned Major Bannister, hot and dusty, his cheek bleeding from the cut of a Chinese sword, and smilingly announced, "Bully good fun while it lasted. What shall I do with the devils we cornered? Take them out and shoot them? No. The boss of the works is dead. And I have a notion that the sect of the fatal obligation died with him. Lug me to the temple, if ye please. I'm all in, but 'tis my wish to see the whole wicked business go up in smoke." Before the torch was applied, that experienced man of war, Major Bannister, suggested that he had never seen a more promising place in which to poke about for loot. The search amounted to nothing until it occurred to the Major to pull the painted joss from off its pedestal. After much heaving and prying, the great image fell crashing to the pavement of the temple. Investigation revealed that underneath it were several compartments accessible by means of cunningly fitted panels. Many papers or documents were found, wrapped in silk, and it was assumed that these were the records of the black deeds of Chung and his organized murderers. They were thrown aside, to be bundled together and taken to the boats. It was the astute Major Bannister who smashed the bottom of one of these compartments with the rifle butt, and rammed his hand through the splintered hole. His groping fingers came in contact with closely packed rows of metal bars. In this manner was discovered the wealth of the temple, the blood money stored and treasured by the infamous Chung, the price of many assassinations. The gold was in stamped ingots, the silver in the lumps or shoes of the clumsy Chinese currency. And there were baskets of English sovereigns, Mexican dollars, and a variety of the coinages which pass over the counters of the money changers of the Orient. Murder as a business had paid well. The sect of the fatal obligation was a flourishing concern. The loot belonged to those who found it. They were troubled by no scruples respecting the heirs of the departed Chung, nor did they consider it their duty to surrender the spoils to the Chinese government. That night a conflagration reddened the ruins of the dead city of Wanglifu. It was the pyre of the painted joss. And when the little flotilla again moved upriver early next morning, a cloud of smoke rose lazily in the still air. Captain Michael O'Shea was still alive, which was rather surprising, for he had passed through experiences extremely disturbing to a sick man. There was tonic, however, in the fact that he had redeemed his failure. The expedition was no longer a sorry jest, and the account of Bill McGuire had been squared. He slept with tremendous earnestness through a night and a day, and when he awoke it was to roar for food and to display the peevish temper of a genuine convalescent. When off duty his comrades became absorbed in the odd occupation of arranging piles of gold bars, silver shoes, and minted coins on the deck of the little houseboat, like children playing with blocks. They smiled a great deal and talked to themselves. Captain O'Shea looked on with an air of fatherly interest. After all, this happy family of his had made a prosperous voyage of it. Dreams of rehabilitation cheered these broken wanderers. They would go home. No more for them the misery, the heartache, the humiliation of the tropical tramp. Their riches might slip through their fingers, but they would make the most of golden opportunity. Like poor MacDougall, they had thrown all regrets away. "'Tis share and share alike," said O'Shea, "but there is a red-headed sailor man at anchor on a farm in Maine, and I think he has a wife somewheres. With your permission we will deal him a share of the plunder. 'Twas poor Bill McGuire that gave us the tip." Unmindful of labor and hardship, Discontented company slowly journeyed to the head of navigation, on the river of 10,000 evil smells, and then trudged overland while O'Shea rode in a covered chair and sang old sea chanties in a mellow voice. When, at length, the English mission station was reached, it was stretching the truth to call him an invalid. The senior missionary, a gentle, very wise old man who had lived for 30 years in the back country, heard the tale told by these tanned, ragged travelers and was horrified that such things should have existed. But he had news for them, and it was thus that he supplied a missing fragment of the puzzle of Bill McGuire. The man came here and we took care of him. But there was no finding out how he had been so frightfully hurt. He was dumb and stupid. Later, I met a native boatman who had found him on the river bank near Wang Lifu. Evidently he had been thrown into the water as an easy way to get rid of the body. Reviving a little, he splashed his way ashore, or the tide left him there. He stayed with us until he was fairly strong, and one morning he was gone. And did he set the house afire? Inquired O'Shea. Why, there were 2 accidental fires in the compound at that time, but we laid it to the carelessness of the kitchen coolies, was the innocent reply. It was Bill McGuire, all right, declared O'Shea. Now, will ye be good enough to look over the Chinese documents we found hid away under the painted joss? The missionary pored over the papers for several hours, and his painstaking translation revealed all that O'Shea cared to know concerning the operations of the sect of the fatal obligation. It had worked in secret to remove enemies for a price. If a merchant wished a business rival obliterated, if an official found others in his way, if it was advantageous to create a vacancy in some other quarter, the murder guild directed by the departed Chung would transact the affair smoothly, without bungling. And those who knew and would have disclosed the secret were frightened into silence by the sight of the brand that was called the dreadful messenger of Chung. It will interest you to learn, as an American, Captain O'Shea, said the missionary, that among these documents is a list of persons proscribed or sentenced to be slain. The most conspicuous name I find to be that of the Chinese ambassador to the United States, His Excellency Hao Suting. It is probable that this terrible fate would have awaited him upon his return to his own country. They potted his brother, exclaimed O'Shea. And he was sick with fear of the thing, for I talked it over with him meself. Well, he can thank Bill McGuire for letting him die in his bed when his proper time comes. 3 weeks later Captain O'Shea sat at his ease upon the piazza of the Grand Hotel, that overlooks Yokohama Bay. He was thinner than when he had put to sea in the Huang Ho steamer, but he appeared to find the game of life quite worthwhile. It was his pleasure to enjoy the tame diversions of a tourist before boarding a mail boat for the long run home to San Francisco. He smiled as he reread a letter written in the crabbed fist of that zealous agriculturist, Johnny Kent, who had this to say: Dear Captain Mike, the Lord only knows what trouble you'll be in when this gets to China. My advice is to quit it and come home. I'm worried about you. Bill McGuire has rounded to, understand. His busted main hatch sort of mended itself by degrees. He had symptoms before you left, and you ought to have waited, but I suppose you can't help being young and Irish. He was terrible melancholy at first, and he ain't real spry yet. I found his wife and little girl for him in Baltimore, and made them come on here. You guessed right about the wax doll. I bought the darndest, biggest one I could find. Bill feels that the family is living on my charity, and being morbid and downhearted, he frets a whole lot about being broke and stranded. He'll be no good to go to sea again. It gives him the shivers to talk about it. I don't need him as a farmhand in the winter, and as for having his wife as a steady housekeeper, I'm fussy and set in my ways. Bill got up against an awful bad combination in China. I won't tell you where it was, for I don't want you to find it. Maybe you'll run across a man named McDougal out there. He was with Bill when they got in trouble. Bill saw a chance to get away in the night, but he stood the crowd off somehow, to give McDougal leeway to join him. And this McDougal lit out with never a thought for Bill. There was something wrong with McDougal, as I figure it out. Maybe he was a good man, but here was one time when he fell down on his job. None of us say much about it, Captain Mike, but we all pray we won't get caught that way. You know what I mean. We're afraid there may be a weak spot in us that we don't know is there until we have to face the music. Anyhow, as I gather from Bill, McDougal was a quitter. If I know anything about men, he has wished 100 times since that he had stayed to take his medicine with Bill. We would a heap sight rather see you come home alive than to go monkeying with the painted Joss. Nothing much has happened except a dry spell in August and corn and potatoes set back. Hens are laying well. Your friend J. Kent. Captain O'Shea chuckled and then became thoughtful. Paddy Blake and McDougal. Charlie Tong. Sin and the wreck of the Huang Ho Wang Li Fu. And the terrible Chung. Much can happen within the space of a few weeks to a man that will seek the long trail. Presently he took from his leather bill book several slips of paper which he had received from the Yokohama Specie Bank in exchange for his gold bars and silver shoes. After making sundry calculations with a pencil, he said to himself, the share of Jim Eldridge, alias Bill McGuire, is $9,862.11, and 'tis here all ship-shape in 2 drafts on New York. My piece of the loot is the same. But the red-headed sailorman will never be the lad he was, and he should not be worried by the lack of money to live on. And could any money pay for what he went through? 'Tis easy to know what I should do. I will not take a cent of the plunder. My share I will give to Bill, and with his bit of it he will be comfortably fixed. An expression of boyish satisfaction brightened his resolute features as he added, a man would be ashamed to take money for such a pleasant vacation as this one has been. Now, I will send a cable message to Bill McGuire and it will cheer him a lot. His account is squared. And I think I have put a crimp in the sect of the fatal obligation. The end. Transcriber's notes. Punctuation, hyphenation, and spelling were made consistent when a predominant preference was found in the original book, otherwise they were not changed. Simple typographical errors were corrected, unbalanced quotation marks were remedied when the change was obvious, and otherwise left unbalanced. Page 319, Slungshot is a maritime tool. End of the Project Gutenberg ebook The Adventures of Captain O'Shea. Updated editions will replace the previous one. The old editions will be renamed. Creating the works from print editions not protected by U.S. copyright law means that no one owns a United States copyright in these works. So the Foundation, and you, can copy and distribute it in the United States without permission and without paying copyright royalties. Special rules, set forth in the General Terms of Use Part of this license, apply to copying and distributing project Gutenberg trademark electronic works to protect the project Gutenberg trademark. Concept and trademark. Project Gutenberg is a registered trademark and may not be used if you charge for an ebook, except by following the terms of the trademark license, including paying royalties for use of the Project Gutenberg trademark. If you do not charge anything for copies of this ebook, complying with the trademark license is very easy. You may use this ebook for nearly any purpose, such as creation of derivative works, reports, performances, and research. Project Gutenberg ebooks may be modified and printed and given away. You may do practically anything in the United States with ebooks not protected by U.S. copyright law. Redistribution is subject to the trademark license, especially commercial redistribution. Start, full license. The full Project Gutenberg license. Please read this before you distribute or use this work. To protect the Project Gutenberg trademark mission of promoting the free distribution of electronic works, by using or distributing this work, or any other work associated in any way with the phrase Project Gutenberg, you agree to comply with all the terms of the full Project Gutenberg trademark license available with this file or online at www.gutenberg.org/license. Section 1. General Terms of Use and Redistributing Project Gutenberg Trademark. Electronic Works. 1.a. By reading or using any part of this Project Gutenberg trademark electronic work, you indicate that you have read, understand, agree to, and accept all the terms of this license and intellectual property trademark/copyright agreement. If you do not agree to abide by all the terms of this agreement, you must cease using and return or destroy all copies of Project Gutenberg trademark electronic works in your possession. If you paid a fee for obtaining a copy of or access to a Project Gutenberg trademark electronic work and you do not agree to be bound by the terms of this agreement, you may obtain a refund from the person or entity to whom you paid the fee as set forth in paragraph 1.e.8. 1.b. Project Gutenberg is a registered trademark. It may only be used on or associated in any way with an electronic work by people who agree to be bound by the terms of this agreement. There are a few things that you can do with most Project Gutenberg trademark electronic works, even without complying with the full terms of this agreement. See paragraph 1.c below. There are a lot of things you can do with Project Gutenberg trademark electronic works if you follow the terms of this agreement and help preserve free future access to Project Gutenberg trademark electronic works. See paragraph 1.e below. 1.c. The Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation, the Foundation Orpgloff, owns a compilation copyright in the collection of Project Gutenberg trademark electronic works. Nearly all the individual works in the collection are in the public domain in the United States. If an individual work is unprotected by copyright law in the United States and you are located in the United States, we do not claim a right to prevent you from copying, distributing, performing, displaying or creating derivative works based on the work as long as all references to Project Gutenberg are removed. Of course, we hope that you will support the Project Gutenberg trademark mission of promoting free access to electronic works by freely sharing Project Gutenberg trademark works in compliance with the terms of this agreement for keeping the Project Gutenberg trademark name associated with the work. You can easily comply with the terms of this agreement by keeping this work in the same format with its attached full Project Gutenberg trademark license when you share it without charge with others. 1.d. The copyright laws of the place where you are located also govern What you can do with this work. Copyright laws in most countries are in a constant state of change. If you are outside the United States, check the laws of your country in addition to the terms of this agreement before downloading, copying, displaying, performing, distributing or creating derivative works based on this work or any other Project Gutenberg trademark work. The Foundation makes no representations concerning the copyright status of any work in any country other than the United States. 1.e Unless you have removed all references to Project Gutenberg. 1.e.1. The following sentence, with active links to, or other immediate access to, the full Project Gutenberg trademark license must appear prominently whenever any copy of a Project Gutenberg trademark work, any work on which the phrase Project Gutenberg appears, or with which the phrase Project Gutenberg is associated, is accessed, displayed, performed, viewed, copied, or distributed. This ebook is for the use of anyone anywhere in the United States and most other parts of the world at no cost and with almost no restrictions whatsoever. You may copy it, give it away or reuse it under the terms of the Project Gutenberg license included with this ebook or online at www.gutenberg.org. If you are not located in the United States, you will have to check the laws of the country where you are located before using this ebook. 1.e.2. If an individual Project Gutenberg trademark electronic work is derived from texts not protected by U.S. copyright law, does not contain a notice indicating that it is posted with permission of the copyright holder, the work can be copied and distributed to anyone in the United States without paying any fees or charges. If you are redistributing or providing access to a work with the phrase Project Gutenberg associated with or appearing on the work, you must comply either with the requirements of paragraphs 1.e.1 through 1.e.7 or obtain permission for the use of the work and the Project Gutenberg trademark. Trademark as set forth in paragraphs 1.e.8 or 1.e.9. 1.e.3. If an individual Project Gutenberg trademark electronic work is posted with the permission of the copyright holder, your use and distribution must comply with both paragraphs 1.e.1 through 1.e.7 and any additional terms imposed by the copyright holder. Additional terms will be linked to the Project Gutenberg trademark license for all works posted with the permission of the copyright holder found at the beginning of this work. 1.e.4. Do not unlink or detach or remove the full Project Gutenberg trademark license terms from this work, or any files containing a part of this work or any other work associated with Project Gutenberg trademark. 1.e.5. Do not copy, display, perform, distribute or redistribute this electronic work, or any part of this electronic work, without prominently displaying the sentence set forth in paragraph 1.e.1 with active links or immediate access to the full terms of the Project Gutenberg trademark license. 1.e.6. You may convert to and distribute this work in any binary, compressed, marked up, non-proprietary or proprietary form, including any word processing or hypertext form. However, if you provide access to or distribute copies of a Project Gutenberg trademark work in a format other than plain vanilla ASCII or other format used in the official version posted on the official Project Gutenberg trademark website, www.gutenberg.org, you must, at no additional cost, fee, or expense to the user, provide a copy, a means of exporting a copy, or a means of obtaining a copy upon request, of the work in its original plain vanilla ASCII or other form. Any alternate format must include the Full Project Gutenberg trademark license as specified in paragraph 1.e.1. 1.e.7. Do not charge a fee for access to, viewing, displaying, performing, copying, or distributing any Project Gutenberg trademark works, unless you comply with paragraph 1.e.8 or 1.e.9. 1.e.8. You may charge a reasonable fee for copies of or providing access to or distributing Project Gutenberg trademark electronic works, provided that you pay a royalty fee of 20% of the gross profits you derive from the use of Project Gutenberg trademark works calculated using the method you already used to calculate your applicable taxes. The fee is owed to the owner of the Project Gutenberg trademark, but he has agreed to donate royalties under this paragraph to the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation. Royalty payments must be paid within 60 days following each date on which you prepare, or are legally required to prepare, your periodic tax returns. Royalty payments should be clearly marked as such and sent to the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation at the address specified in Section 4, Information about donations to the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation. You provide a full refund of any money paid by a user who notifies you in writing, or by email, within 30 days of receipt that he does not agree to the terms of the full Project Gutenberg trademark license. You must require such a user to return or destroy all of the works possessed in